The move from the relentless pulse of Chicago to the hushed lanes of Willow Creek Estates, nestled just outside Portland, Oregon, was meant to be a balm for Julian Croft. Years spent wrestling, demanding clients and navigating the concrete canyons had left the minimalist architect craving stillness, a quiet space where his own design philosophy could breathe without compromise. He sought refuge, a canvas for a slower, more intentional life after the creative burnout had become too much to bear. This quiet corner of the Pacific Northwest promised rain-washed tranquility and a chance to reconnect with his own artistic roots, far from the cacophony he'd left behind. His modest new home at the end of the cul-de-sac was exactly that canvas. One of his first projects, almost a meditative act, was the mailbox to passers-by. It might seem just a receptacle for letters, but for Julian it was a statement, a small piece of personal expression staking its claim. Foregoing the standard-issue plastic boxes lining the street, he crafted a sculptural piece of weathered Corten steel and polished teak, angular, modern, yet designed to harmonize with the surrounding Douglas firs and damp earth. It wasn't ostentatious, merely distinct, a quiet declaration of personal style and the meticulous care he intended to pour into his new sanctuary, a first step in making this house truly his own. That distinction, however, did not go unnoticed in the suburban living experiment Julian had embarked upon Silas Blackwood, whose own sprawling colonial anchored the opposite side of the cul-de-sac, like a stone fortress, observed its installation with a tightening jaw. A man whose lawn was manicured with military precision and whose past tenure as the HOA president still cast a long shadow. Blackwood embodied the very uniformity Julian had sought to escape. His presence felt heavy, a constant judging gaze from behind perfectly trimmed laurel hedges, a silent guardian of perceived neighborhood standards. It took less than a week for the inevitable confrontation, the start of an unexpected neighbor dispute. Blackwood appeared uninvited at the edge of Julian's nascent native plant garden, posture rigid as the fence posts he clearly preferred. That thing, he began gesturing dismissively towards the mailbox with a thick finger, doesn't quite blend with the established aesthetic here. Croft. Most folks stick to the approved designs, keeps things looking neat, cohesive. The underlying message was unmistakable. Conform. Julian, though, preferring peace, felt a familiar prickle of defiance against arbitrary control. A ghost of battles fought in design review meetings, he offered a polite but firm smile. "Thanks for the input, Mr. Blackwood," Julian replied evenly, meeting the older man's gaze. "But I quite like it the way it is. It reflects the house and my own style." He wouldn't yield on this small, symbolic patch of his new life. The architect in him refused to bow to enforced mediocrity, especially not here, not now. The initial weeks in Willow Creek Estates unfolded with the gentle rhythm Julian had craved. Rain pattered against the roof. The scent of damp cedar filled the air, and the quiet hum of suburban life replaced Chicago's roar. He sketched new designs, tended his fledgling garden, and slowly began to feel the knots of tension loosen. Yet beneath the surface calm, a discordant note began to play, subtle enough at first to be dismissed, but persistent. It started with the mailbox. One morning, Julian noticed it was tilted just slightly off its perfect vertical alignment. "Strong wind last night," he reasoned, straightening it with a meticulous nudge. Or perhaps the mail carrier bumped it. A few days later, a heavy ceramic pot containing a Japanese maple sapling, which he'd carefully positioned beside his front steps, had been shifted several inches to the left. It was minor, almost trivial. Maybe I just remember placing it differently, he told himself, repositioning it while a small flicker of doubt ignited. Then came the sprinklers. He'd set them precisely to water his new drought-tolerant plants early in the morning, but twice he found them running mid-afternoon, soaking the pathways instead. Reprogramming them felt oddly unsettling, a passive-aggressive behavior he couldn't quite pin down. Each incident viewed in isolation was easily explained away. A coincidence, an oversight, forgetfulness. But taken together, coupled with the unsettling feeling that settled over him, whenever Silas Blackwood was out puttering in his own immaculate yard across the street, they began to weave a thread of unease. Blackwood rarely looked directly at him. Yet Julian could feel the weight of his attention, a prickling awareness on the back of his neck. Was he imagining it? Was the desire for peace making him overly sensitive to minor disturbances? Or was this the beginning of something deliberate, a quiet campaign of neighborhood tension, designed to make him feel unwelcome, subtly chipping away at the sanctuary he was trying to build? The ambiguity itself was becoming a source of stress, a quiet question mark, hanging heavy in the otherwise tranquil Oregon air. The fragile peace of Willow Creek shattered one crisp Tuesday morning. Julian stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, ready to embrace the quiet start to his day, only to stop dead in his tracks. His mailbox, the carefully crafted piece of steel and teak that stood as a small symbol of his new beginning, was brutally mangled. The sleek corten steel frame was bent inward at an unnatural angle, as if struck repeatedly with a heavy object. One of the teak panels had splintered, sharp fragments littering the damp grass below. The entire structure leaned precariously, clearly wrenched from its concrete footing. There was no ambiguity this time, no room for rationalizing it away as wind or accident. This was deliberate, violent property vandalism. A wave of cold anger washed over Julian, quickly followed by a surge of frustration. The subtle disturbances, the moved pot, the altered sprinklers, they suddenly clicked into place, no longer isolated incidents, but calculated steps leading to this overt act of aggression. The violation felt intensely personal, an attack not just on a piece of metal and wood, but on his right to exist peacefully in his own chosen space. His eyes instinctively flickered across the cul-de-sac, towards Silas Blackwood's imposing house. No proof, not yet. But the certainty settled in his gut, heavy and undeniable. The older man's disapproval hadn't just lingered, it had festered into malice. This wasn't just about aesthetics anymore. It was about control, about forcing compliance through intimidation. The neighbor conflict escalation had just crossed a significant line. Standing there amidst the wreckage, Julian felt the architect within him stir. Alongside the anger, he saw the damage not just as destruction, but as a structural failure under malicious force. The initial design focused on aesthetics and harmony hadn't accounted for this kind of targeted attack. Retreat wasn't an option. Replacing it with a standard-approved box felt like surrender. No, this required a different solution. As he bent to examine the twisted metal, the frustration began to harden into steely resolve. He wouldn't just repair it, he would rebuild it. Stronger, more resilient. He wouldn't just be standing his ground, he would reinforce it. The quiet sanctuary he sought might require fortification. And Julian Croft, the meticulous designer, began sketching the new blueprints in his mind. The following weekend saw Julian Croft trading architectural sketches for welding gear and bags of quick-set concrete. This wasn't just a repair, it was a redesign born of necessity, a direct response to aggression. The grace of the original teak was sacrificed for raw strength. He sourced thick-gauge industrial-grade steel plate, the kind used in structural reinforcement cutting, and welding it with the same precision he once applied to building models. The elegant lines of the previous design gave way to a more brutalist angular form, less a piece of art, more a functional bastion. The post wasn't just set in the ground. Julian dug deeper, creating a significantly larger reinforced concrete footing designed to withstand far more than casual vandalism. It was an exercise in applied resilience. His engineering mind focused wholly on creating something virtually indestructible. The process itself was cathartic. The clang of hammer on steel, the bright flare of the welder, the physical labor of mixing and pouring concrete. It channeled his frustration into tangible creation. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. It was about enduring. It was about sending a clear, unspoken message across the quiet cul-de-sac. As he worked, he noticed occasional glances from neighbors. A young couple jogging past slowed, their curiosity evident. An older woman, Mrs. Gable from 2 doors down, peered through her lace curtains, her expression unreadable but attentive. Julian felt a subtle shift in the neighborhood dynamics. His solitary struggle was becoming a quiet spectacle. Finally, the installation day arrived. Hoisting the heavy steel box onto its massively reinforced concrete anchor took considerable effort. When it was finally bolted secure, it stood solid and imposing at the curb, a stark contrast to the flimsy standard-issue boxes nearby. It was taller, thicker, undeniably robust, a miniature fortress guarding the edge of his property. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, perhaps, but it possessed a certain uncompromising integrity. It was a testament to his refusal to be intimidated, a symbol of defiance cast in metal and stone. Across the street, Silas Blackwood emerged onto his porch, ostensibly to inspect his already flawless rose bushes. He lingered, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze fixed on Julian's handiwork. Though he said nothing, the stiff set of his shoulders and the deep furrow in his brow radiated palpable irritation. The swift, defiant reconstruction clearly hadn't been anticipated. Julian's reinforced mailbox wasn't just a functional object anymore. It was a direct challenge to Blackwood's presumed authority, an unyielding presence disrupting his carefully curated vision of suburban uniformity. Julian met the silent glare briefly before turning back to admire his work, a grim satisfaction settling within him. The fortress stood ready. Sleep had come fitfully, Julian's mind still tracing the hard lines of the steel mailbox even in the quiet dark. Then shortly after 2 a.m., a jarring cacophony ripped through the suburban stillness. The tortured screech of tires fighting for grip followed immediately by a sickening resonant crunch of metal impacting metal. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't deniable, it was raw, vehicular violence echoing down the cul-de-sac. Julian bolted upright in bed, heart hammering against his ribs. Adrenaline surged, chasing away the last vestiges of sleep. Throwing on a jacket over his pajamas, he flicked on the porch light and cautiously opened the front door, peering into the pre-dawn gloom. The air hung heavy, smelling faintly of burnt rubber. His eyes immediately sought the curb. The fortress stood battered, yet angry. New gouges scarred the thick steel plate and the reinforced concrete base showed fresh scrapes. But it remained defiantly upright, rooted firmly in the earth it had held. Relief warred with fury as Julian stepped fully outside, his gaze sweeping the scene. Dark arcing skid marks marred the asphalt near the mailbox, stark against the pale street surface and scattered across the pavement. Glinting under the porch light were fragments of plastic and glass, the unmistakable detritus of a vehicle collision. He knelt, his architect's eye scanning the debris field. Most were small, unrecognizable shards. But then he saw it, a larger curved piece of clear, textured plastic, unmistakably part of a headlight casing. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hand. It felt substantial, designed for a larger vehicle, a truck perhaps. The image of Silas Blackwood's meticulously maintained oversized pickup truck, a gleaming silver behemoth that always seemed slightly too large for these quiet streets, flashed instantly into his mind. The evidence pointed directly across the cul-de-sac. A hot wave of anger pulsed through him, the urge to storm across the street, bang on Blackwood's door, and demand answers raw and immediate. But years of disciplined thinking, of analyzing problems before acting, held him back. Confrontation now fueled by adrenaline and accusation, without absolute proof, would be impulsive, likely unproductive. Blackwood would deny everything. No, this unsolved mystery required a different approach: logic, precision, evidence. Carefully, methodically, Julian went back inside, retrieved a zip-top bag from the kitchen, and returned to the curb. He placed the headlight fragment inside, sealing it like a crucial specimen. This wasn't just debris anymore, it was Exhibit A. The game had escalated dramatically, moving beyond petty vandalism into dangerous territory. As he retreated into the quiet of his house, the plastic bag heavy in his hand, Julian's mind was already shifting gears. The architect was becoming an investigator, the defense necessitating an offense built on cold, hard proof. Julian's anger from the pre-dawn incident simmered beneath a surface of calculated calm. Direct confrontation was still unwise, but inaction felt like surrender. His logical mind, honed by years of architectural problem-solving, turned towards verification. The headlight fragment was a tangible clue, a starting point for a quiet investigation. There were only a couple of reputable auto body shops within easy driving distance of Willow Creek Estates, under the guise of needing a quote for a minor scratch on his own car door, a plausible errand. He drove to Miller & Sons Collision Repair the next afternoon. The shop smelled of paint thinner and engine oil, a familiar backdrop to countless repairs. After discussing his car's negligible scratch with the grizzled owner, Dave Miller, Julian casually steered the conversation. Crazy thing. He began, leaning against the counter, as if making small talk. Found a piece of a headlight near my place the other night. Looked like it came off something big, maybe a truck. Made me wonder if someone had a fender bender nearby. He subtly pulled the bagged fragment from his pocket, just enough for Miller to glimpse it. Ever see parts like this come through? Miller squinted at the fragment through the plastic. Yeah, looks like standard Ford truck issue. F-150, maybe late model. He wiped greasy hands on a rag. Pretty common around here. He paused, scratching his chin. Funny you mention it, though. Had an older fella in here just yesterday asking about replacing a passenger side headlight and fixing a cracked bumper on a silver F-150. Said he hit a deer, but... Miller trailed off, shrugging slightly, implying doubt without outright gossip. Lived somewhere out your way, I think. Didn't get the job, though. seemed more interested in the cost than anything. An older fella, silver F-150, lives nearby. It wasn't definitive proof, but the pieces fit. Silas Blackwood perfectly, thanking Miller for his time. Julian left the shop, the mechanic's words echoing in his ears. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, painting a clearer picture of Blackwood's clumsy, destructive act. His certainty solidified 2 days later, when he checked his mail. The real mail inside the battered but functional steel box, tucked amongst the junk mail and bills, was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside, a single sheet of cheap printer paper bore a stark typed message: "Your mailbox is a hazard and an eyesore. It's only a matter of time before someone gets seriously hurt. Do the right thing and take it down before there's another accident." No signature, no finesse. Just a blunt, anonymous threat. The shift in tactics was chilling. Physical assault on the mailbox hadn't worked, so now came psychological pressure, veiled intimidation, masquerading as neighborly concern. Julian felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Carefully using gloves, this time he placed the letter into another evidence bag, photographing it first. The trail was no longer just physical. It was turning into a calculated campaign of fear. He filed the letter away with the headlight fragment, his resolve hardening further. Blackwood wasn't just a bully, he was becoming a menace. The anonymous letter had cast a pall over the following days. Julian found himself scanning the street, more often noting every time Blackwood's silver truck rumbled past. Then one overcast afternoon, while retrieving his mail, he noticed something new. Long, jagged scratches marred the surface of the reinforced steel mailbox, scoring deeply through the protective patina. These weren't accidental scrapes. They looked deliberate, forceful, as if someone had taken a heavy tool, maybe a crowbar or a large screwdriver, and viciously dragged it across the metal. It was petty, yes, but also deeply infuriating. Another deliberate poke, another attempt to provoke. Enough was enough. The passive investigation and silent documentation felt insufficient. Ignoring the knot of apprehension in his stomach, Julian walked directly across the cul-de-sac, his steps firm on the damp pavement, and rang Silas Blackwood's doorbell. The older man answered, after a moment, his face registering faint surprise before settling into its usual impassive mask. "Blackwood," Julian began, keeping his voice level, despite the simmering anger. "Someone took a tool to my mailbox. Left deep scratches all over it." He held Blackwood's gaze. "Given our previous conversation and the other incidents, I thought perhaps you might know something about it." Blackwood's expression didn't flicker. He folded his arms defensively. "My sympathies for your property damage, Croft," he replied, his tone dripping with false concern. "But I assure you I have better things to do than concern myself with your unique curb appeal. Perhaps some local kids' vandals are everywhere these days?" He offered no further explanation, no curiosity, just a flat dismissal. The stonewalling was absolute, infuriatingly effective. Frustrated, but not defeated, Julian turned away. Direct confrontation yielded nothing but denial. He needed context, perhaps support. He thought of the watchful eyes of Mrs. Gable, the older woman 2 doors down, whom he'd mentally renamed Eleanor Croft, borrowing from a favorite author. Later that day, finding her tending her meticulous dahlia beds, he struck up a conversation, eventually steering it towards neighborhood history, and cautiously towards Blackwood. Eleanor, initially reserved, seemed to assess him surfily before speaking. "Silas," she said quietly, snipping a spent bloom. "Likes things just so, always has. Ran the HOA with an iron fist years ago. Doesn't take kindly to anything, or anyone, he deems out of line." She didn't offer specifics about the mailbox, but confirmed Blackwood's long-standing pattern of controlling behavior. His next stop was Marcus Jones, a younger man with a friendly demeanor, who lived further down the street with his wife and young daughter Julian, had seen him wrestling with a stroller, and offered a wave previously. This time he introduced himself properly, and after some preamble shared his own troubles. Marcus listened intently, his expression shifting from polite interest to shared frustration. "Man, Blackwood," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Tell me about it. Last year he filed 3 official complaints against us with the city because our trim paint was, and I quote, not historically harmonious. Cost us time and stress, even though the city dismissed it. The guy's relentless when he gets something in his head." And hearing these stories, Eleanor's quiet confirmation, Marcus's specific grievance, was both disheartening and validating. Julian wasn't alone in experiencing Blackwood's petty tyranny. He hadn't just found context, he had found his first potential neighborhood allies, voices that might lend weight to his own escalating struggle. The deep scratches on the steel were the final catalyst. Julian realized passive documentation and hoping for the best wasn't a strategy. It was merely waiting for the next act of aggression. His engineering mind shifted from structural defense to electronic deterrence. It was time to implement a robust home security system, specifically targeting the vulnerable area around the mailbox. Over the next few evenings, he meticulously installed a high-resolution security camera, discreetly positioned under the eaves of his garage, offering a clear view of the curb. He paired this with a sensitive motion detector near the mailbox base linked to both a piercingly loud external alarm and an instant alert system on his phone. It was a digital tripwire, designed not just to record, but to actively repel. For several nights, the system remained silent, the only alerts triggered by passing deer or wind-blown branches, easily dismissed after a quick check of the camera feed. Then, just before midnight on a moonless Thursday, the silence was obliterated. A high-pitched, deafening alarm shrieked through the cul-de-sac, momentarily stunning Julian awake. Simultaneously, his phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand. He grabbed his phone, pulling up the live camera feed even as he threw on clothes. The infrared showed grainy darkness, the alarm still wailing, but nothing was immediately visible near the mailbox itself. Heart pounding, Julian grabbed a heavy flashlight and rushed outside. The alarm cut off automatically after its preset duration, plunging the street back into an unnerving quiet. He swept the flashlight beam across the curb. The mailbox stood untouched, but something else lay glinting on the damp grass near its base, a heavy steel crowbar about 2 feet long, its surface slightly scuffed and dirty. It hadn't been there earlier. The implication was immediate and chilling. Someone had been attempting to pry the reinforced box loose, likely fleeing, when the unexpected alarm shattered their concentration. They'd dropped their tool in their haste. This discovery elevated the situation significantly. A property crime involving a potential weapon left at the scene felt far more serious than simple vandalism. Julian carefully photographed the crowbar in situ, before using thick gardening gloves to pick it up, placing it gingerly into another large evidence bag. He immediately called the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation calmly but firmly, emphasizing the discovery of the crowbar. This time, the response felt different. The dispatcher sounded more concerned, and the officer who arrived took detailed notes, examining the crowbar carefully, still in its bag. Leaving a tool like this behind that shows intent, maybe panic, the officer noted grimly. This isn't just kids messing around anymore. He assured Julian they would follow up directly with Mr. Blackwood. Later, peering through his living room window, Julian watched as the police cruiser pulled up across the street. He saw the officer speak with Blackwood on his brightly lit porch. Blackwood's posture remained rigid, arms crossed, but Julian thought he detected a flicker of something, annoyance, unease beneath the usual stony facade. The police didn't stay long, but their visit felt like a small victory. A formal warning delivered. Blackwood was now officially on their radar, thanks to his own escalating carelessness and the silent sentinel Julian had erected. The police visit seemed to hang heavy in the air for a few days. A tense, brittle quiet settled over the cul-de-sac. Julian allowed himself a sliver of hope that perhaps the official warning combined with the undeniable evidence of the crowbar had finally driven the point home to Silas Blackwood. Perhaps the escalation would cease. That hope dissolved entirely early Friday morning when he stepped out to retrieve the recycling bin. Strewn across his otherwise immaculate lawn, ripped garbage bags had vomited their contents. Coffee grounds, rotting vegetable peels, junk mail, and crumpled food wrappers, creating a disgusting, deliberate mess. It was a blatant act of retaliation, childish in its execution, but deeply insulting in its intent. The message was clear. You involve the authorities. This is what you get. The petty harassment felt designed to degrade and exhaust him. Suppressing a wave of fury, Julian methodically photographed the scene from multiple angles before beginning the unpleasant task of cleaning up Blackwood's refuse. As he worked, his resolve crystallized. This back and forth, this escalating cycle of aggression and passive documentation wasn't sustainable. It was time to pursue formal legal action. That afternoon, Julian sat across a polished mahogany desk from Isabel Moreau, a lawyer specializing in property disputes and harassment cases whose sharp eyes seemed to miss nothing. He laid out the entire sequence of events, presenting his meticulously organized file of photos, notes, and bagged evidence. The headlight fragment, the anonymous letter, the crowbar. Isabel listened intently, her expression calm but serious. "Mr. Croft," she said finally, her voice measured. "What you've described constitutes a clear pattern of harassment and escalating property damage. Your documentation is excellent. We have strong grounds for a restraining order and potentially a civil suit for damages if this continues." Hearing his situation validated by a legal professional was immensely reassuring, a confirmation that he wasn't overreacting. They discussed the next steps the paperwork involved and the potential timelines. However, Silas Blackwood had launched his own offensive. Just 2 days after Julian's consultation with Isabel, an official-looking envelope arrived from the City of Portland Bureau of Development Services. Julian opened it with a sense of foreboding. It was a formal notice. A complaint had been filed by Silas Blackwood, alleging that Julian's mailbox constituted an unsafe structure and a hazard to public passage, potentially violating municipal codes. The irony was staggering. While Julian was pursuing legal protection from Blackwood's attacks, Blackwood himself was manipulating the system, attempting to weaponize bureaucracy against his victim. It was a calculated, manipulative tactic designed to deflect blame and create a frustrating bureaucratic hurdle. Julian stared at the notice, a mix of determination and exasperation swirling within him. The fight wasn't just at the curb anymore. It was opening up on a new official front. The official complaint notice from the city, prompted by Blackwood's duplicity, spurred Julian into swifter action. He wouldn't let his antagonist control the narrative through bureaucratic maneuvering. Armed with Isabel Moreau's guidance, he drafted his own formal complaint to the Bureau of Development Services, meticulously detailing the timeline of vandalism, harassment, and intimidation he had endured. Crucially, he attached supporting documents, copies of his police reports, photos of the damage, including the garbage dumped on his lawn, a copy of the anonymous threatening letter, and concise signed statements he had collected from Eleanor Croft and Marcus Jones. Eleanor's statement recounted seeing Blackwood's truck parked near Julian's property late at night, around the time the crowbar was discovered, noting his suspicious lingering. Marcus's statement outlined his own previous negative experience with Blackwood's baseless complaints regarding his house paint, establishing a pattern of vexatious reporting. Submitting the packet felt like another necessary step, albeit one tangled in red tape. It was shifting the battleground partly onto the city's turf, hoping the weight of evidence and community support would counteract Blackwood's manipulative complaint. Weeks felt like they crawled by as the city processed both complaints. Finally, Julian received a call, scheduling an on-site inspection. The inspector arrived on a typically drizzly Portland afternoon, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Diane Bellwether, who introduced herself with a firm handshake. She examined the reinforced mailbox thoroughly, measuring its setback from the curb, tapping the thick steel, inspecting the concrete footing. Julian explained the history, showing her photos of the original mailbox and the subsequent damage that necessitated the rebuild. "Well, Mr. Croft," Inspector Bellwether stated plainly, making notes on her clipboard. "Structurally, this thing is sound. Over-engineered, if anything." She looked towards Blackwood's house. "Based on standard codes, there's nothing inherently unsafe or hazardous about its placement or construction. It doesn't impede passage." She then acknowledged the counter-complaint filed by Julian. That said, she continued, her tone becoming more serious. "Your documented harassment claim, supported by neighbor statements and police reports, alongside Mr. Blackwood's complaint about this structure, it paints a complicated picture." She confirmed that while the mailbox itself passed inspection, the underlying issue of harassment required further investigation, likely involving coordination with law enforcement. Blackwood's complaint, while unfounded regarding safety codes, had successfully muddied the waters, forcing the city to navigate the interpersonal conflict alongside the structural assessment. It was a partial victory. The mailbox was officially deemed safe, but the slow grind of bureaucracy meant the harassment issue remained unresolved through this channel, tangled in the system, just as Blackwood likely intended. Julian thanked the inspector, recognizing this official validation was important, even if it wasn't the final word. The weeks following the inspector's visit were deceptively quiet. Blackwood seemed to keep a lower profile, perhaps wary after the official scrutiny. Julian, however, remained vigilant, the security camera system becoming a routine part of his evening checks. He'd scan the day's motion-triggered recordings, mostly finding squirrels or delivery drivers before settling down. The sense of being watched had lessened, but not vanished entirely. His foresight in installing the system felt less like paranoia and more like prudent preparation. That prudence paid off decisively. Late one Wednesday night, Julian was working late in his home office, refining a set of architectural plans when his phone pinged with a motion alert from the camera covering the mailbox. He muted his computer speakers and pulled up the live feed, his heart giving a familiar jump. The infrared illuminated the scene with ghostly clarity. A figure was crouched low beside the reinforced mailbox. Even in the monochrome night vision, the stooped shoulders and the distinctive shape of the man's head were unmistakable. Silas Blackwood. He wasn't just lurking, he was actively working on something, holding what looked like a large wrench, applying force to the heavy bolts securing the steel box to its concrete base. Julian watched, scarcely breathing, as Blackwood strained, trying to loosen the connections. The high-resolution camera captured everything: the determined set of Blackwood's jaw, the glint of the metal wrench, the specific bolts he was targeting. There was no ambiguity, no room for denial. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a calculated attempt to dismantle the structure piece by piece under the cover of darkness. This was the smoking gun evidence he had been waiting for. Adrenaline spiked, but Julian forced himself to remain calm and methodical, while keeping one eye glued to the live feed, showing Blackwood still struggling with the stubborn bolts. He dialed 911 with his other hand. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice answered. I need police at 14 Cul-de-sac Lane, Willow Creek Estates, Julian said, keeping his own voice low but firm. I am witnessing vandalism in progress via my security camera. My neighbor Silas Blackwood is currently attempting to dismantle my mailbox with a wrench. He is at the curb right now. He stressed the immediacy, the fact that the perpetrator was caught red-handed. The dispatcher confirmed units were on their way. The next few minutes stretched into an eternity. Julian remained glued to the feed, watching Blackwood grunt with effort, occasionally glancing nervously up and down the deserted street. Then flashing blue and red lights reflected off the wet pavement at the entrance to the cul-de-sac. Julian saw Blackwood startle, dropping the wrench with a clatter, caught faintly by the camera's microphone. He straightened up hastily, trying to appear casual, just as a police cruiser rolled silently to a stop beside him. Julian watched the interaction unfold on screen. The officers approaching Blackwood, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Blackwood's visible surprise turning into indignant sputtering. The officers calmly questioning him. Julian knew they wouldn't just take Blackwood's word this time. He immediately saved the crucial video segment and emailed it to Isabel Moreau with a brief, urgent message. The following morning, Isabel confirmed receipt. Julian, this is exactly what we needed, she stated emphatically over the phone. Clear footage of him actively tampering with your property late at night. It completely demolishes any claim he might make. Armed with this undeniable proof, Isabel swiftly filed the necessary motions. Within days, the court granted the restraining order. Silas Blackwood was now legally forbidden from approaching Julian or his property line. It felt like a monumental legal victory, a shield finally forged thanks to digital eyes and calculated planning. The restraining order Julian had hoped might finally draw a definitive line, forcing Silas Blackwood into grudging compliance through legal consequence. Instead, it seemed to shatter the man's remaining restraint, pushing him from calculated harassment into brazen, almost unhinged defiance. The legal boundary, rather than acting as a deterrent, became a target for his escalating frustration. Blackwood wasn't just pushing back anymore. He was openly engaging in violating the restraining order. The first act came just days after the order was served. Julian awoke to find crude, dripping black letters spray-painted across his clean garage door. Get out! The message was blunt, ugly, and undeniably Blackwood's work given the context and timing. The violation felt like a slap in the face, a sneering disregard for the court's authority. Julian photographed the graffiti extensively before the paint could fully cure, documenting the date and time. Then contacted Isabel Moreau, immediately adding this blatant breach to the growing file. Cleaning the spray paint felt like scrubbing away venom. A week later, the attack shifted back to vehicular assault, but with a different, more personal twist. Returning home from errands, Julian found deep, muddy ruts gouged into his front lawn, leading in a clear arc from the street across the grass and back onto the pavement. Tire tracks unmistakably from a heavy truck scarred the vulnerable green space he had been carefully cultivating. It wasn't just property damage. It felt like a territorial marking, an aggressive act of aggression designed to intimidate and demoralize. Again, photos were taken, timestamps noted, and the evidence forwarded to Isabel. The lawn could be repaired, but the escalating pattern was deeply disturbing. The final provocation, however, was perhaps the most bizarre and unsettling. Left directly on his doorstep one morning was a small, crudely constructed object, a pathetic, misshapen replica of his original mailbox hastily assembled from flimsy cardboard and duct tape. Scrawled across it in thick black marker were the words, "Know your place." It was mockery, mixed with menace, a pathetic attempt to belittle him, while simultaneously issuing another veiled threat. This desperate behavior spoke volumes about Blackwood's deteriorating state of mind. He wasn't just angry, he seemed to be spiraling, lashing out with increasingly erratic and personal attacks. Through each incident, Julian forced himself to maintain composure, channeling his anger and disgust into meticulous documentation. Every photograph, every timestamp, every email to Isabel Moreau felt like adding another brick to the wall of evidence they were building. He refused to engage directly with Blackwood, knowing that was likely the reaction the man craved. His focus remained firmly on the legal strategy. Isabel was already preparing the civil lawsuit for property damages and harassment, and each violation of the restraining order only strengthened their case, painting a clear picture of Blackwood's flagrant disregard for the law, an escalating pattern of behavior. Blackwood's desperation was inadvertently forging the very weapons that would be used against him. Julian had reinforced his vigilance after the last wave of desperate acts. The cameras remained active, the motion alerts on his phone constantly monitored. He felt perpetually on edge, wondering what form Blackwood's next attack would take. The answer arrived late one Saturday night, not with the roar of an engine or the scrape of metal, but with the furtive movements of smaller figures caught in the camera's infrared glare. The motion alert pinged just after 1 a.m. Julian pulled up the feed instantly. Two figures clearly younger, teenagers by their build and jerky movements, were lurking near the mailbox. One held a can aloft, presumably spray paint, while the other seemed to be fiddling near the base, perhaps trying again to loosen the bolts or damage the concrete footing. They were clumsy, nervous, constantly glancing over their shoulders. This wasn't Blackwood's direct handiwork, but it felt orchestrated, a cowardly escalation using proxies. Julian immediately dialed 911 again, relaying the situation. Vandalism in progress. 2 individuals appear to be teenagers currently damaging my mailbox at 14 Cul-de-sac Lane. He watched the feed intently as the teenagers continued their clumsy attempts. One sprayed a messy, illegible black scrawl across the steel. Before the sound of an approaching siren sent them scrambling, they bolted down the street just as a police cruiser arrived, its headlights sweeping the area. The officers were quick, managing to intercept one of the fleeing figures a block away. While the other vanished into the darkness between houses, Julian provided the officers with the clear video evidence capturing the teenagers' actions. An hour later, one of the officers returned to Julian's door. "We apprehended one of them," the officer reported. "Local kid 16 under questioning, and after seeing the video footage he admitted to it." The officer paused, his expression grim. He also stated that he and his friend were paid $50 each to mess up the mailbox by your neighbor, Mr. Silas Blackwood. The confirmation hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was criminal solicitation involving minors. Blackwood hadn't just violated the restraining order himself. He had actively recruited and paid teenagers to commit crimes on his behalf, deliberately corrupting impressionable youths to carry out his petty vendetta. It revealed a depth of malice and manipulation that was truly shocking. Blackwood wasn't just a neighborhood bully, he was actively outsourcing crime. This confession was the bombshell evidence Isabel Moreau had been waiting for. It moved the case beyond a simple neighbor dispute or property damage claim. It demonstrated a calculated pattern of conspiracy and a willingness to involve others in illegal activity, all stemming from his obsession with the mailbox. Julian immediately forwarded the police update and the new video footage to Isabel. Her response was swift and decisive. "Julian, this is it. This is the final nail. His credibility is destroyed. We have witness testimony from the individual he paid. This significantly strengthens not only the civil suit, but potentially opens him up to criminal charges as well." Blackwood's desperate attempt to distance himself by using others had ironically provided the most damning proof against him, captured irrevocably by the technology Julian had put in place. The Multnomah County Courthouse felt unnaturally quiet, the muted atmosphere amplifying the tension, humming beneath the surface. Julian sat beside Isabel Moreau at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Months of stress, documentation, and escalating conflict had led to this moment, the civil court hearing against Silas Blackwood. Across the aisle, Blackwood sat stiffly beside his own lawyer, a harried-looking man shuffling through papers with an air of resignation. Blackwood's usual mask of haughty indifference seemed cracked, revealing glimpses of unease beneath. Isabel began methodically laying out the case with precision. She presented the comprehensive timeline, starting with Blackwood's initial disapproval and moving chronologically through each incident. Enlarged photographs filled the courtroom. Monitors, the initially damaged mailbox, the reinforced replacement, the skid marks, the spray-painted garage door, the gouged lawn, the mocking cardboard replica. The physical evidence itself, the bagged headlight fragment, the anonymous letter, the crowbar, was formally submitted. Isabel then played key segments of the security footage Blackwood caught, red-handed with the wrench violating the restraining order, the teenagers spray painting and admitting they were paid. The visual evidence was stark, undeniable. The testimonies solidified the narrative. Eleanor Croft took the stand first, her voice clear and steady despite her age. She recounted Blackwood's long history of needing control, described seeing his truck near Julian's property late at night, and detailed his suspicious behavior. Her words painted a picture of a man operating under the cover of darkness, his actions deliberate and observed. Next came Marcus Jones, who nervously but firmly described his own past run-in with Blackwood's baseless complaints, establishing a clear pattern of harassment against neighbors who didn't conform to Blackwood's arbitrary standards. "He makes people feel unwelcome, Your Honor," Marcus stated plainly. "Julian's just the first one who truly fought back." The most damning testimony came from the teenager apprehended by the police. Visibly ashamed but resolute, he recounted how Blackwood had approached him and his friend offering cash to vandalize Julian's property. "He said it wasn't a big deal," the teenager mumbled, looking at the floor. "Just mess up the mailbox a little, make it look like it wasn't worth the trouble." He confirmed receiving payment from Blackwood. Under Isabel's gentle questioning, his account was credible and devastating to Blackwood's character. When it was Blackwood's turn, his defense was as weak and disjointed as Julian had anticipated. His lawyer attempted to paint Julian's mailbox as an actual hazard, citing Blackwood's supposed concern for neighborhood safety. He tried to dismiss the vandalism as unrelated incidents, possibly committed by unknown parties or disgruntled youths unconnected to his client. Blackwood himself took the stand, attempting to project an image of a concerned longtime resident unfairly targeted. But under Isabel Moreau's sharp surgical cross-examination, his facade crumbled. "Mr. Blackwood," Isabel asked calmly, "if you were so concerned about the mailbox being a hazard, why did you never file a formal complaint with the city before Mr. Croft documented your harassment and obtained a restraining order against you?" Blackwood stammered, offering vague excuses. "And can you explain," Isabel pressed, holding up a still from the security footage, "why you were attempting to dismantle Mr. Croft's hazardous mailbox with a wrench at 2 o'clock in the morning?" He blustered, denied, claimed he was merely inspecting it. Isabel then confronted him with the teenager's testimony. Blackwood turned red, sputtering denials that rang hollow against the weight of evidence. He sat hunched in his seat afterwards, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The judge, a woman with a reputation for sharp insight, listened intently throughout her expression, growing increasingly severe. After final arguments, she didn't deliberate long. Her ruling was swift and unequivocal. Silas Blackwood was found liable on multiple counts: harassment, property damage, and multiple violations of the restraining order. The judge cited the overwhelming physical and video evidence, the credible testimonies, particularly the teenager's confession, and Blackwood's complete lack of credibility on the stand. Justice, meticulously documented and patiently pursued, had finally arrived. The verdict delivered a palpable sense of relief washed over Julian. It wasn't just about a mailbox anymore, it was about accountability. Okay, here is the content for Chapter 15, following in the provided outline and requirements. Chapter 15, Echoes of Silence. As Julian and Isabel Moreau stepped out of the courtroom into the wide, echoing hallway, they were met by familiar faces. Eleanor Croft and Marcus Jones were waiting their expressions, ones of profound relief. Several other neighbors Julian recognized from the cul-de-sac who had attended the hearing. In quiet support, approached them tentatively. "Julian, thank you," Eleanor said softly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You did what none of us felt we could. Maybe now things will finally be peaceful." Marcus grinned, shaking Julian's hand firmly. Seriously, man, you set an example, showed him he wasn't untouchable. The other neighbors murmured agreement, their gratitude palpable. It wasn't just Julian's victory, it felt like a collective weight had been lifted from the community atmosphere. The bully had been faced and faced down publicly. Across the hallway, Silas Blackwood emerged with his lawyer, his face pale and drawn. He avoided looking towards Julian and the small group of neighbors, his usual imposing posture replaced by a defeated slump. The public humiliation was evident as he hurried towards the elevators, ignoring the quiet stares that followed him. The whispers started almost immediately among the neighbors gathered there. Rumors that Blackwood, burdened by hefty fines ordered by the judge, compensation for Julian's damages, legal fees, and punitive damages, and stripped of his self-appointed authority, was already considering selling his house and leaving Willow Creek altogether, driving home. Julian felt an exhaustion settle deep into his bones, heavier than any physical labor. The battle was won. Justice served, but the cost had been significant. Months of stress violated peace, the constant low-level anxiety. He looked out at the familiar rain-slicked streets, the fight replaying in his mind. Had it been worth it? Yes, unequivocally. It wasn't just about defending a mailbox. It was about defending his right to peace, his refusal to be intimidated into conformity. It was about drawing a line against petty tyranny. Back in his quiet house, the silence felt different now. Not tense and watchful, but genuinely calm. He walked to the front window and looked out at the reinforced mailbox standing stalwart at the curb. It bore the scars of the conflict, the gouges, the scrapes, but it stood unbroken. It was more than just steel and concrete. It had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the unexpected fight he hadn't sought, but hadn't backed down from. The falling action of the conflict was beginning, leaving echoes of silence. Where tension had once reigned, he had stood his ground, and in doing so had inadvertently helped restore a measure of peace, not just for himself, but for the entire street 3 months later. Under a rare stretch of Oregon summer sunshine, the rumors solidified into reality. A large moving truck lumbered into the cul-de-sac, parking awkwardly in front of Silas Blackwood's sprawling colonial. Julian watched from his window as movers efficiently loaded furniture and boxes. Blackwood himself remained mostly indoors, emerging only briefly to supervise his face, drawn and impassive. He didn't glance towards Julian's house, didn't acknowledge any of the neighbors who subtly observed the proceedings. By late afternoon, the truck pulled away, leaving behind an empty house and a palpable sense of quiet finality. Blackwood's departure marked the true end of the conflict, a silent resolution requiring no further words. In the intervening weeks, Julian had worked to erase the physical scars of the feud. He'd carefully repaired the ruts in his lawn, reseeding the grass until it blended seamlessly. He'd repainted the garage door, restoring its clean surface. He even considered softening the reinforced mailbox, perhaps adding some planting around its base, but ultimately decided against it. Its stark, resilient form felt right, a quiet reminder of the ordeal endured and overcome. Life settled into the peaceful rhythm he had originally sought, but with a significant difference, he no longer felt like an isolated newcomer. To celebrate the newfound calm and acknowledge the support he'd received, Julian decided to host a simple backyard barbecue. He sent out handwritten invitations, and to his pleasant surprise, nearly everyone from the cul-de-sac attended. Laughter and conversation filled the warm evening air. Marcus Jones manned the grill, flipping burgers while Eleanor Croft shared fascinating stories about the neighborhood's early days. Neighbors mingled easily, connections forming or deepening in the relaxed atmosphere. They talked about organizing a block watch, not out of fear, but from a renewed sense of unity, and planting flowers along the shared sidewalk areas. Julian, circulating among his guests, felt a genuine sense of community integration he hadn't expected when he first moved, seeking solitude. Later that evening, as the gathering wound down and the fireflies began to blink in the twilight, Julian stood near the front of his property. Looking out at the street, his gaze rested on the mailbox. It stood sentinel at the curb, solid and unwavering under the darkening sky. It was no longer just a symbol of defiance, but a marker of his journey. From seeking isolation to finding connection, from enduring conflict to building peace. He had defended his small patch of ground, and in doing so had laid the foundations of belonging, stepping back inside his quiet house, closing the door on the conflict that had once consumed his life. Julian Croft finally felt truly home. Drawing wisdom from Julian Croft's challenging journey, we find powerful lessons for navigating our own lives. Firstly, honor your individuality and protect your personal space. Don't let external pressure force you into a mold that doesn't fit or compromise boundaries, essential to your peace. When confronted with conflict or unfairness, respond with strategic calm, not just reactive anger. Julian's meticulous documentation and evidence gathering highlight the power of logic and preparation over impulsive confrontation. This underscores the need to establish and firmly defend your boundaries using appropriate channels, whether personal conversations or formal systems. When they are crossed, crucially, remember the strength and connection. Don't underestimate the power of seeking allies and community support. Julian's success was amplified by Eleanor and Marcus. Facing challenges collectively can transform an isolating ordeal into a shared victory. Finally, embrace resilience not as passive endurance, but as active rebuilding. Like Julian, reinforcing his mailbox view, setbacks as opportunities to strengthen your resolve, adapt your strategy, and emerge more capable. Cultivating authenticity, strategic responses, clear boundaries, community ties, and active resilience provides a strong foundation for navigating life's inevitable conflicts and building lasting personal peace.